what do we hold sacred? Things that we really commit to, things that we see as important for ourselves, for others, for the world. Every religion has sacred texts that specify or that imply the commitment of the believer or the practitioner, a commitment to something, to the earth, to its living beings, or whatever it may be. These commitments and these texts may be contextualized or reorganized occasionally. They emphasize sometimes different details, even though they come from the same tradition. Or they amplify the voices of religious leaders at the time. Out of numerous examples that would take us at least a year to exhaust, let us look at just one from each of two sets of religious scripture. The basic beliefs of Buddhism are often summarized by the Four Noble Truths. And those Four Noble Truths are listed basically in the order in which the person who became known as the Buddha experienced them or became aware of them. And briefly, these Four Noble Truths are that suffering exists, pain exists, unhappiness exists, and that it is caused by our desires or our attachments. Attachments to things we want, and attachments to not wanting to suffer. But also that we can reduce suffering by lessening our desires. And we can do this by following the path of the Dharma or the truth. That all sounds very simple, and that is why it's called also the Four Basic Truths. It gets a little more confusing when we look at another way of summarizing the basic Buddhist beliefs. And that is by means of the Eightfold Path. Some people say about these Buddhists' scriptures and tenets, oh, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of another, it goes on and on. And indeed, that is typical for a tradition that is an oral tradition. There's a lot of enumeration. So in the Eightfold Path, I'm not going to list all of the Eightfold Paths, you can Google them very easily, but they describe these basic ideas in a different way, by means of what we should be practicing. We should be practicing right understanding, right intentions, right speech, right actions, and so on. And the first two of these, right understanding and right intention, really point to those Four Noble Truths. So it's a different way of emphasizing them. And looking at the details, being on the path, what does that really mean? Well, go look at the Eightfold Path. So the basic sacred story of commitment is packaged differently, but it's basically the same. And you may also have noticed how there are similarities between some of these tenets and the principles of Unitarian Universalism and our basic values. Sometimes a story becomes a different one because of its interpretation. And there is a well-known passage of the New Testament in the book of Matthew. I'm sure you've all heard of it. And if not, you'll hear it here. It's in chapter 25, verses 34 to 40. And we read in one of those verses, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. That is verse 34. And a little later in verse 40, we read, as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters, you did it to me. And who is me? Depending on which translation you read, me is the king, me is Jesus, or me might be God. Yeah, the least of these. Are these people Christians? Or is the least of these referring to all beings, at least all people? I would interpret it as the latter, all. It refers to all. After all, when the book of Matthew was written, there was no such designation as Christians. It was just the people, you know. So the same words can be interpreted differently depending on who reads them or who uses them, who applies them, who benefits from them. So this is something to keep in mind. In the life stories and speeches of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, we also see many sacred stories of commitment. And they all point to the beloved community. We often talk about creating that beloved community, that beloved society where all are welcome and all are equal. Just like in that second interpretation in that verse of the book of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 40. Where all are equal, regardless of skin color, immigration status, gender identity, or any other categorization. For today, I was especially inspired by the several marches that took place from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. It's a 54-mile walk. You don't do that in one day. It typically takes about 3 or 4 days for people who are just demonstrating and marching. So it was a march to peacefully address voting rights by peaceful means. And I'm sure you have read, heard of, or know the basic facts of that story. On a Sunday, in the beginning of March 1965, about 600 people met in Selma, Alabama, to go on foot to Montgomery, Alabama, 54 miles away, on a peaceful march to seek voting rights for blacks. Selma at the time had a racist, volatile sheriff who was easily angered and riled up. And the state of Alabama, many of you remember, had a racist governor named George Wallace. George Wallace ordered his state troopers, about 150 of them, to use whatever means necessary to prevent, he didn't say to prevent violence, to prevent a march, is what he said. And these state troopers were positioned on the far end of the Selma Bridge, which was called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It still is called that. More about that later. And county deputies took position on the other side after the marchers had already gone on the bridge. So they were basically trapped in between. And then there were white people who were watching the whole thing like it was a movie. What resulted is remembered as Bloody Sunday, a story that tells of brutal attacks on the people in the march, using such things as fire hoses, That's a lot worse than a garden hose if you've ever experienced anything like that. Tear gas and rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire. John Lewis, you may remember him as a congressional representative. He was then a young civil rights leader. I think he was 25, and he suffered a fractured skull that day. 17 people had very severe injuries, and 50 more had minor injuries among that small group of people. Ironically, that bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, was named after a leader in the Ku Klux Klan. I think the rank was something like Grand Dragon or some such thing. And I remember avidly writing letters together with my students at the university to request that the name of the bridge be changed. And indeed, there was a campaign that we contributed to name it the John Lewis Bridge. But John Lewis himself was against that. Keeping the name, he said, would keep telling the story of racial injustice with all its aspects. And it is so important to remember these stories with all their facets. And that is something that inspires us this month too, to not hide pieces of stories if they add to our interpretation of what really happened. What not everyone knows is that actually there were several Selma to Montgomery marches. 2 days after Bloody Sunday, Martin Luther King restarted the 50-mile march. But he and the 1,500 to 2,000 marchers that were with him had to turn back at the bridge because they were stopped again by a line of state troopers. And then, several weeks later, a federal judge ruled that 300 protesters could complete the march from Selma to Montgomery, but escorted by the National Guard. And again, several weeks later, Martin Luther King led a huge number of marchers out of Selma to the Capitol building in Montgomery. The number of people had increased to as many as 25,000 by the time they actually arrived at the state capitol. So the numbers kept rising. The movement could not be put down. And that place at the Capitol is where Martin Luther King delivered one of his most famous speeches, the one that is remembered as the "How long, not long" speech. Have you heard that speech? Okay, it's a wonderful speech. I'm not going to read the whole thing here today, but here are a few snippets of that speech, and I quote, "We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. How long will justice be crucified and truth buried? It will not be long, because truth crushed to earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." For some reason, I think these are appropriate words for a day like today. And yes, something happened in 1965. The Voting Rights Act was passed in August of that same year. 1965. It explicitly enforced the 16th Amendment of the Constitution. That 16th Amendment was also a sacred commitment that had been passed already a century before, namely, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any states on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Why are we still worried about voting rights then? It's because the judiciary has to put things in place to make sure that practices that suppress voting are prevented. And today that makes me reflect, what happened? What about us today? May we make and may we keep commitments to write our stories. May these be sacred commitments, to repeat our stories and to retell what has happened from the point of view of those who are poor, who are oppressed, and who are marginalized. And in the process, may we commit to helping immigrants, people under threat, and other vulnerable populations. May that be a sacred commitment. As we heard in the lyrics of today's anthem, we dream of a world of justice, and we build a bridge creating new paths we walk together, embracing each one. We boldly stand, we walk in love, we are united in purpose. How long for such a world to come into being? In Martin Luther King's words, how long? Not long. The arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And may it be so. Let us now rise in body or spirit to sing our closing hymn. It is number 1028 in